Hello.
Our story begins in the lower levels of the Coruscant city. Ahsoka Tano was stumbling around aimlessly. She had been abandoned by the Jedi Order. All of her life's work had gone up in flames because of her apparent friend. Barriss would spend years of her life in prison for her actions, and her actions completely changed the course of Ahsoka's life. She stared down alleyways and searched for a motel or something to settle into so she could finally sleep. Her eyes were heavy, as she had been walking ever since she left Anakin at the steps of the temple. Being that it was sunset when she left the temple, it was sometime in the middle of the night. She had only gone down a couple of levels, but she could still see the city skyscrapers from her location. Ahsoka felt her stomach rumble, so she slipped towards a diner that was open. Another Dexter Jester ripoff. Big surprise. But there was a benefit. Everything was cheaper. The closer she got, the more uneasy she became. Ahsoka rubbed her eyes and slipped into the doors of the diner and barely made it to the bar, where she settled in. The man behind got her something to drink on the house. It was a caffeinated drink, so it would wake her up a little bit, which it did. They didn't speak much, but there was food to be had, which Ahsoka ate quickly before abandoning the bar. She was again on the prowl for a place to sleep, and luckily for her, there was a motel next to the diner, and she could slip in. The sun was starting to rise over Coruscant, and she was ready for some shut-eye. She got close to 3 hours of solid sleep before blaster shots woke her up the first time, a fistfight the second time, and another altercation that woke her up the final time. She didn't know what they were rambling about, but she grew more and more frustrated each time she was awoken. Now that she was wide awake, it was closer to the middle of the day. The emotional burden of the previous day, as well as all the trauma that came with one's life flashing before their eyes, ate away at her. She slept so much due to both physical and emotional struggles, but she was mostly refreshed. Ahsoka knew she needed to keep going further into the underworld of the city, so she readied herself. As she walked into the diner, she felt uneasy to say the least. It felt like there were eyes inside the restaurant that were watching her. She scanned the room and saw no one looking in her direction. A different waiter stood behind the bar and got her some food and some Jawa juice. While she was waiting for it to be delivered, a deep and elder voice rolled over her shoulders and placed itself next to her. She knew who it was the moment she heard him, but she didn't want to believe it. Ahsoka side-eyed Dooku and then turned to confirm her fears. She reached for her saber, but he told her to not make a mess of this man's establishment. That wouldn't be fair. Both she and he didn't realize she didn't have her sabers on her. He simply wanted to talk, if that was alright with her. Ahsoka's voice stiffened as she got defensive in posture and in tone. She demanded to know what he wanted to talk about. Dooku then spoke up, apologizing for her betrayal at the hands of the Jedi. Her face contorted disgustedly, annoyed that he dare bring such sentiments towards her. She wanted to know why he was doing this. Why was he here? And Dooku just said that he understood what it felt like to be betrayed by the Order. And? What did that mean? Was he trying to recruit her? Dooku smiled when the words left her mouth. Recruit was being too bland. He expressed shame in the dispatch of his former assassin. Asajj meant a lot to him, despite how cold he was to her following her betrayal. Ahsoka asked Dooku why she would join him, knowing fully how cruel he could be towards those that served him. He understood her position, but he wouldn't be making Sidious aware of this. They would serve each other. After all, she was looking for a new path, was she not? The emotional distress of her current situation could have her tossing and turning around the Coruscant underworld for the rest of her life. He had seen what happened to individuals released by the Jedi Order. Most of them were never seen again. Those who were usually ended up on the nightly news for being murdered or dying of some sort of overdose. These were things that happened to Jedi who couldn't make it past their youngling trials. He said that maybe it wasn't his place to care, but they were of the same lineage. She was directly tied to him whether she liked it or not. They were inextricably connected. He trained Qui-Gon, who trained Kenobi, and she picked up from where he was going, and saying both Anakin's name and then her own. Dooku admitted shame in the fact that Master Kenobi could never let go of his pride to see what Qui-Gon would have chosen. Unlike Obi-Wan and Dooku, Ahsoka had never met Qui-Gon. Heard stories, sure, but mostly from Obi-Wan's perspective, because Anakin didn't talk about his past. Dooku explained that if Qui-Gon was still alive, he would have been with him, trying to right the wrongs of the Jedi and of the Republic. Dooku opened up into a little tirade about his theories and beliefs about the Republic, and how important it was for them to change the future. After all, he turned towards her with a sense of warmth. It wasn't like he was serving Sidious for his own enjoyment. Ahsoka, like her experience with the Bontiris early during the war, turned back with curiosity. What did he mean? Dooku told her sincerely that he was only serving with Sidious so that the Republic could be reformed into a more unified system. He didn't care about the Sith and never did. They were a pathway to achieving galactic peace, stopping slavery, destroying the established balance of the galaxy so that this new order could rise. The order wasn't Sith or separatists. It was intergalactic, meant for everyone and given to the people. She could be a part of it, and if Skywalker or Kenobi wanted a seat at the table, they were more than welcome. This was a fight for the future, not one out of a personal vendetta. Dooku planted some credits on the counter and told the waiter that this meal was paid for. He then turned to her and told her that he wasn't forcing his path on her. He was offering it. She was always free to leave, regardless of what she believed about him or was told about him. Dooku moved to get up, and before he could, he was stopped. Ahsoka could realistically take this offer. It wasn't the fact that she liked the idea, but there was perhaps something there. They were connected by a string. From Dooku to Jin to Kenobi to Skywalker, it was entirely possible that she might find such familiarity with Dooku. He's partially to be blamed for the way Obi-Wan and Anakin turned out, because he trained Qui-Gon. And maybe she didn't know Master Jin, but she was willing to learn more about him through the lens of his former teacher, the person who should, technically speaking, know him the best. Ahsoka told Dooku that she didn't like this idea, and she wasn't super favorable of it, but she was willing to try. They were connected. Maybe something good could come from this. Dooku smiled softly and nodded his head, telling her to eat her food. There was much finer delicacies waiting for her on Sereno. Dooku left her to eat so that she could spend her time thinking about what had been said, and it all started to click for her. She felt uneasy initially, but there was something that felt right about this. Maybe she could find a purpose for herself. Like Dooku said, he wasn't serving the Sith, right? So if he wasn't serving the Sith, rather a higher purpose, then maybe there was an out for her. And honestly, who could blame Ahsoka for confiding in someone like Dooku? She needed distance from the people she trusted, which at the moment were a few clones, Anakin and Padme. This was her chance to experience a completely different reality, so why not give it a shot? Also, not for nothing, Dooku was really convincing. She eventually caught up with Dooku and they took a different shuttle than his Solar Sailor and the typical CIS shuttle back to Sereno. It was a luxury yacht-type vessel, very nice and definitely not something Dooku was known to fly in, which is how he got to Coruscant without getting tagged. During their trip through hyperspace, she asked Dooku how he was betrayed by the Jedi. It was the final thing that crossed her mind when she finished eating, and she wanted to know. The two of them sat in the cockpit as a droid tapped the toggle on the hyperdrive, and the viewport was consumed by blurs of blue. He sighed heavily, telling her that he was betrayed because they refused to evolve. The order he was taught about, from 102 BBY to 86 BBY, was not what he was living in. The Jedi were supposed to be knights of the Republic, saviors of the people, protectors of the weak. They were an order loyal to no one other than their code, because they served the galaxy. But they were not that. His master often berated him openly for believing the Jedi should be more. As the years went on, his opinions continued to differ. Master Windu, for example, stole a seat from his on the council because Dooku was willing to investigate something. Master Sifo Dyas assaulted him out over the moon of Felucia, and that poor old soul, Master Yaddle, hunted him down and cornered him, demanding that he surrender himself and return to the Order. All of these personable experiences were lies, but how could Ahsoka know any different? Many of them happened when she wasn't even born, or an infant. Windu never stole anything. He was surprised by his appointment to the council, especially at the age of 24. Sifo Dyas was murdered by his best friend, but it was a lie Dooku told himself to make it so that he could live with his actions. And the same could be said of Master Yaddle. She tried to reason with him, and followed him to the industrial complex to help him, to assist him in his beliefs, and he executed her. All secrets that Ahsoka didn't need to know. Their conversations lasted until they got to Sereno, where Dooku was to play everything very loosely. He let her have the run of the facility, and he openly trusted her. He didn't really, and there were eyes on her whenever she moved throughout the castle, but he wanted the illusion of trust to be present. Tyranus didn't have any super ill intentions. He was ordered to do this on behalf of Sidious. The Dark Lord wanted Anakin's people to be pulled towards darkness, so that Anakin would have more of a reason to want to kill Dooku, and a reason to be resentful towards the Jedi Order for forcing her out. Dooku only knew about the second part. It was just another elaborate plan made by Sidious. Tyranus, on the other hand, wasn't fully convinced of the idea to turn Ahsoka to the dark side. He didn't care about her per se, but he wasn't going to repeat what happened to Asajj. The next few days would be a total culture shock for Ahsoka. She didn't have to fight, she was fed decent meals, and she was protected on Sereno. She was no longer the enemy, and she wasn't fighting for her life every day. It was a completely different worldview, and all the while her new friend continued to feed her information from his own beliefs. He had fully reported everything to Sidious, who wanted him to fully transform Ahsoka into an acolyte of darkness. She would become a Sith tool or be casted off. Dooku obeyed his master's commands, but he had to be honest with himself. He was struggling to live without a friend. He did genuinely care about Asajj, and turning on her broke him in more ways than one. He hoped that Ahsoka could be a replacement of sorts, maybe not a full-blown replacement, but someone who could fill a hole in his heart for him. He believed that this would be a sound idea, but it had some holes that he needed to cover before Ahsoka realized what she was for him and the Sith plan. Ahsoka thrived on Sereno regardless of all of this. She enjoyed a relatively peaceful life because, as Dooku promised, he wouldn't bother her, and he didn't. They continued chatting on the daily, but it was just simple conversations. Dooku was really trying to figure out how he could manage to convince her to join him, because it wouldn't be as simple as it was with someone like Asajj or Grievous. This transformation needed gaslighting of the top degree, and luckily for him, Ahsoka made his job so much easier on the first week mark of her stay on Sereno. Most of the time she was on the planet, she was just thinking to herself, sleeping, meditating, or eating. She had felt so much pain and pressure from her experience with the Republic court hearing. She was betrayed by the Council, and she lived a few days of her young life believing that it would be taken from her. The concept of death as a 16-year-old was daunting, especially due to the war, but that was always a risk. Being in prison for a crime she didn't commit, with a certain chance of Tarkin bringing down the death penalty, nearly guaranteed her death, so she spent days grappling with such a reality. Ever since arriving here, she was calming down from that, because it was such an emotional burden and weight to carry. After having sifted through her own thoughts on the matter, she came to Dooku with questions of what else the Jedi Order and or the Council had done. Tyranus was prepared. He knew that statements about Windu, Sifo Dyas, and Yaddle had resonated with her, so he eagerly awaited his chance to drive the dagger deeper into her mind, and promised her information that she didn't know was skewed. And he did plan on using her master as an example of it. She sat down for breakfast in the morning. Dooku was feasting on some coveted pastries from the most brilliant bakers in this sector of the galaxy. It was how he started every day. And she quietly asked him what else the Jedi had done. He gestured towards the food and asked that she eat, as he asked how she slept. Ahsoka quickly answered and moved back around to her question, as she grabbed something from a plate adjacent to her. Dooku sighed and asked who she would like to know about, and if there were any Jedi off limits. She shook her head as she unraveled a fork and knife from a napkin. He told her that some of these betrayals were selfish, others were simply belligerent, and others were against the very code they proclaimed so proudly. Obi-Wan, for an example, was deeply infatuated with the Duchess of Mandalore, but one wouldn't know that from the way he always prided himself on his loyalty to the code, correct? He turned the conversation around and talked about some other examples, a few being recent, the others being more distant. He ended his little chat about the Jedi with a statement that would shock Ahsoka to her core. She knew Anakin was a violent man, and she was well aware of what he was capable of. But did she know what Skywalker did mere months before taking her on as an apprentice? She shook her head. He told her about Anakin's secret love affair, one more realized than Kenobi and Kryze. But that wasn't all. His voice firmed, and he told her that Anakin slaughtered an entire village of Tusken Raiders without purpose. She said that couldn't be true, but it was. He had returned to Tatooine to find his mother, and she had passed away of a natural death, a painful illness, albeit, but natural. Anakin couldn't just kill the Lars, so he left. Skywalker claimed that the Tuskens made his mother sick, but that was never the case. Even more tragic, he slaughtered the men, women, and children without mercy. He then put the picture into Ahsoka's head, just to hammer down the point. Innocent little Tusken babies who had done nothing wrong were wiped out of existence. Skywalker may have claimed to be a Jedi, and morally responsible, but it was no different than the Republic and the Jedi's treatment of the Kalesh during the Huck Wars. This led to a completely different tangent about why General Grievous hated the Jedi and the Republic. He told her that he knew she was bright, but some things in the galaxy are far deeper than the systems they hail from want to make them out to be. The Jedi always talk a big game but can never support it, because they themselves are immoral, treacherous villains. The galaxy revered them and now it doesn't. That wasn't a coincidence. Yoda had been the voice of absolute power and control in the Jedi Order for centuries. At best, he would be complacent, at worst, corrupt, which did Ahsoka believe he had become. She sat almost heartbroken at these revelations, at these truths that she didn't come to see. Of course, Dooku was exaggerating a lot of these truths, but that didn't matter. They were still, in a way, true. Between Ahsoka's own turmoil over the betrayal she suffered by the High Council and the constant influx of truths she couldn't deny with facts that she didn't have, but could legitimately believe were true, she had her head spinning in circles. What was she supposed to do now? The next few weeks would be a lot of varying conversations, the first of which being more so continuous of the breakfast talk that they had already had. They slowly evolved into what Dooku wanted to do after the Clone War, and how he planned to get rid of Sidious. They transformed their talks about their own bond as potential master and apprentice. It was at this moment when she could sense that Dooku was changing as she had. Somewhere deep in Tyranus' corrupt and black heart, there was the hope of something better. After Sidious was dead and the war was over, they could actually have a true bond, something like what he had with Qui-Gon Jinn. It was a hope, and as the few remaining months till the end of the Clone War counted down, Dooku could feel his own presence in the Force shift. He was initially focused in darkness, and he slowly shifted to the light. Ahsoka had a slight change to darkness, but it was mostly due to using Ventress's sabers. Their friendship, though, that was truly special. They didn't cross boundaries, and Dooku became very caring for his great-great-grand student. Ahsoka and he had their troubles, and she even had her questions for why he tried to kill her in the past, but he always answered with a solid expression that he never meant anything personal by it. He assumed that Skywalker had corrupted her, especially after killing the Tuscans. Now that they finally had a chance to get to know each other, he believed that she was the change their lineage needed. Qui-Gon would have adored her. Tyranus, of course, had to leave Sereno for his own missions, but he made sure that Ahsoka had time to train with the Magna Guards. Out in his own missions, as per instructed by Sidious, he would taunt Skywalker and Kenobi about Ahsoka's transformation. But even he didn't feel super into the concept of turning Ahsoka all the way to the dark side. He liked the idea of making Anakin upset, sure, but aside from that little high, he didn't care much for the idea of being a Sith or being a Darksider. So much of his own internal transformation had seen him feeling more youthful and energetic, as he and Ahsoka formed their bond as great-great-grandmaster and great-great-grand student. Ahsoka's tie to her current teacher allowed the two of them to bond over saber duels, but most of all, they enjoyed each other's presence over meals where they spoke about varying topics. Like a grandfather with a grandchild, they just enjoyed each other's company. Ahsoka enjoyed listening to Dooku's stories and perspective from inside the Order and even outside of it. The way Tyranus spoke about the Jedi from his youth was with optimism, like they were once the pride of the galaxy. It gave a lot more context for why Dooku became Tyranus in the first place. While there were some lies here and there, they started to rapidly decrease the more Dooku found himself abandoning his obedience to the dark side of the Force. Sidious could obviously sense this rapid shift, but he allowed it to continue. It would be used to turn Skywalker and to destroy Dooku all at the same time. It was a part of his plans to control the future he desired, to have Ahsoka killed by Anakin in his rage, to have Dooku killed by Skywalker turning to Vader. It was all going to be perfect. Ahsoka and Dooku fell into comfort with their mutual changes, as they became almost familial. They spent a lot of time around each other, and Ahsoka became a lot more radicalized politically. She, unlike Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, quickly fell into line with Dooku's teachings. Much of this was only possible because her mind was breached by these concepts and how they were delivered to her at a young age. She was 16 and now 17, which meant she was fully able to embrace the concepts he was placing in front of her, and really bite into them hard. She was once a Jedi, and she would never serve the Sith, but Dooku's outlook on the galaxy was one that made sense. The war had changed her view of the Jedi, the Republic, and herself. Without her greatest betrayal by the High Council, Dooku wouldn't have ever had such ease convincing her to see his ways. The war itself started drawing towards its conclusion, and Dooku gave Ahsoka a simple choice. He wanted her to accompany him at Coruscant. She had spoken to Grievous once, which wasn't the most pleasant conversation ever, but Dooku wanted to prove to her what he believed about Grievous. She was against the idea of going to Coruscant though. Sure, they could politically win, but she didn't want to see the temple or the Senate building destroyed, and he expressed that the temple wasn't their objective. She wanted to know what was then. It was Palpatine. They were going to destroy their forces and capture the planet. Ahsoka asked what Dooku's master planned on doing with Palpatine, and Dooku grinned, telling Ahsoka that his master wouldn't be concerned with that. This brought curiosity to her face, where Dooku revealed that Sidious was Palpatine. They were one and the same. Ahsoka couldn't really fathom what Dooku was saying, and this made her worry for her former teacher. What was Anakin going to do because of this? Tyranus explained that Sidious picked Skywalker because of his actions against the Tusken Raiders. That cold-blooded killer was the perfect material for the Sith. Ahsoka wore more pain on her face than shock as she tried to grapple with this reality. She was more upset that Anakin was being picked, but what did Sidious have in mind? And Dooku stopped in his tracks and told her that every clone had a list of executive orders within them. Those orders could redefine the galaxy, and Palpatine planned on using Anakin against the Jedi. Something that became abundantly clear during these conversations was that Dooku didn't intend on destroying the Jedi. Maybe he did, and he was lying about it, but from Ahsoka's perspective, he didn't. But the fact that Sidious would destroy the Jedi as a whole and use Anakin to do it was disgusting. Sidious was playing off of Anakin's bad side, and using it to destroy something she was upset at, but still cared about. Her warped view of the galaxy based on the Jedi teachings and her perspective on the war had changed due to Dooku. He was no longer the mass murderer she believed he was. Dooku was a kind and sensible person, one who wanted the best for her, and didn't believe in the Sith path. He joined them out of desperation, and it was the Jedi who betrayed him. In Ahsoka's morals, she sided with Dooku because she could relate to being turned on by the Order. She just didn't want Anakin to fall down such a dark path, and she told Dooku that she was coming to Coruscant to stop her former teacher and show him the right way out of this. Dooku nodded, and it was set in stone. Without the Republic sending aid to Mandalore, the full 501st would deploy over Coruscant, but it would not directly impact Anakin's and Obi-Wan's flight through the battlefield and landing sequence on the Invisible Hand. Inside the starship, Ahsoka was antsy. She wanted to kill Palpatine herself, but it wouldn't be right. He was a monstrous villain, and he needed to die. But Dooku knew that his master could kill her with a flick of a wrist if he wanted, and he didn't want Ahsoka to die like that. She deserved a full life. She was the exact same person he was when he turned to the Sith in desperation. He wanted a better galaxy for the future, and his young friend was that future. Ahsoka at just 17 was the individual who would benefit the most from his decision to join the Sith, and that remained a constant here. When Kenobi and Skywalker arrived, Dooku would fight the two Jedi and dispatch Kenobi, just so that he wouldn't be a voice of reason within this fight. Before Skywalker could fully engage with Dooku again, he was stopped when he heard the ignition of two sabers. He turned back to see Ahsoka. She had changed so much, but why or how could she throw her lot in with Dooku? He stepped away from Tyranus as he asked Ahsoka how could she become that. It hurt her to see how Anakin would simply see this decision as anything but her own. She asked him why she couldn't see why she made this decision. He turned towards Dooku and demanded to know what he had done, anger pulsating out over his voice. Tyranus just told Anakin that Ahsoka learned the truth, and there was nothing wrong knowing who and what the Jedi were. They weren't beyond saving, but they, at this current moment, were too corrupt to serve this galaxy, just like the Republic and just like Palpatine. Ahsoka called to her former master, telling him to stop this now, to join them. He didn't have to keep serving the corrupt state of the Republic. There was a life full of choice for him on this side. All he needed to do was let go. He didn't have to serve them anymore. Anakin believed that Dooku had twisted her mind, because that was exactly what Dooku said to him on the Pike homeworld of Obadiah. That was Anakin and Dooku's last encounter, and Dooku had gloated about Ahsoka's turn to darkness. She really hadn't, but the red lightsabers told Anakin a different story. He told Ahsoka that he would save her, as he lunged at Dooku, who barely defended himself in time. Their blades clashed as Ahsoka leapt down from the catwalk to stop them from fighting, believing that all could be saved. As she got closer, Anakin turned back and slammed his blade down on hers, throwing her backwards. It wasn't that she wasn't capable of defending the assault, but she didn't expect Skywalker to be so brutal when actually fighting. She looked at him as he pressed Dooku backwards. Their blades collided and Anakin shoved with so much anger and hatred that he pressed Dooku's own saber into his eye, blinding him. Ahsoka watched in horror, calling out to Anakin, telling him to stop, but there wasn't anything getting through his head. All he saw was red, and he was going to kill Dooku. He shoved Dooku back against the wall and slashed him right up the spine before turning around and shoving his lightsaber right through his stomach. Dooku felt shock and air leave his body, just as Qui-Gon did so many years before, as a furious Skywalker kicked the limp body off the blade and watched him drop. Dooku's dreams of a better future with an actual friend died right here inside of the invisible hand. Ahsoka's jaw dropped as Anakin turned back, reaching out his hand and telling Ahsoka to come back to him. The dark side was not a place to be, and she couldn't believe it. Everything Dooku had said about Anakin was right. She had never been on the receiving end of Anakin's fury, and now she had. She watched the only person who treated her kindly after she left the Order murdered for taking her in. The story about the Tuskens and Order 66 had to be true. This Skywalker right in front of her could murder children, and she hadn't seen it before. Now she did. Behind Anakin, Palpatine smiled as he watched Vader's birth before his very eyes. Anakin tried again to call to Ahsoka, but she stopped him, with terrible sorrow in her eyes. Dooku was right. The Jedi couldn't even see it. Anakin was confused, but neglected what she had said until she said that Sidious was right behind him, egging him on, pushing him further into darkness, and Anakin was too blind to see it. He had just killed her friend in the least Jedi way possible. The fight was over once Dooku was blinded, and Anakin executed him. She stepped backwards with heartbreak in her voice and told Anakin that he had just been lured into a trap. Sidious would turn him against everyone he loved, including herself. He had already won. Anakin turned back to see Sidious' scowl covering his face. He asked Palpatine if this were true, and he turned slowly towards Anakin, asking if he believed a disciple of Dooku over himself. Yeah, that made sense. What could Ahsoka be thinking? He was confused and upset, but not nearly as much as Ahsoka was, who had summoned General Grievous, not for Anakin, but for Palpatine. Ahsoka kept herself together as she rushed out of the room and eventually entered a separatist shuttle and got herself into hyperspace. Once she saw the blue flash, tears flooded her eyes. Her friend was brutally murdered and she just watched. Inside of the Tower of the Invisible Hand, Grievous raged into the room with 6 Magna Guards. Skywalker was picking Obi-Wan off the ground when Palpatine was electrocuted from behind. He was busy telling Anakin that if they took Obi-Wan they would never make it, and he was then shocked before Grievous cut his chest off of his torso and clawed his head into oblivion as Skywalker leapt backwards to defend himself, trying to see if Palpatine had a chance at surviving. He did not. Skywalker would fend off the attack of the ludicrous General Grievous. Their blades would echo across the chambers as Magna Guards kept Skywalker from making a legitimate strike. During this duel, Kenobi would wake up and surprise attack the Magna Guards, giving Anakin a chance to break past the dueling droids and start his assault on Grievous, who now, trapped in the tower, had nowhere to run to. Blades clashed. Kenobi blocked off Grievous' escape, and the 2 Jedi would defeat the droid general inside of the Tower of the Invisible Hand. Due to their location, they could escape long before the ship was sent crashing back down to the surface of the planet. Ahsoka, on the other hand, returned to Sereno to find a note for her. It was left behind by one of Dooku's guards. As any great-great-grandfather would, he left her his will. She was the only person to actually see him for an actual person in a long time. He had recorded her a hologram message. It was a very apologetic one. He confessed his exaggerated lies, and told her that he didn't want her to fall back down the path of obsolescence. In their time together as a family, he saw what could have been had he stayed a Jedi, or what may have been had he been there for Qui-Gon on Naboo all those years ago. These were just simple quandaries that would never become reality, as time had already passed. Dooku told her that the responsibility was large, but in her control were the CIS reserve forces. He transferred all control from the Council to himself, and she could control their destiny. In some way, shape, or form, he knew that Anakin would kill him like an animal. Sadly, he was proven correct. Ahsoka wept, but she decided that it was time to end this destructive conflict. She, of course, wasn't going to wage war. That was never an option, but a political one was certainly up for consideration in her mind. Her heart hurt, and with the revelation of Dooku's lies and half-truths at her disposal, she locked herself away inside of Castle Sereno. What happened outside of it, she didn't care. She needed this time to think to herself. Ahsoka was able to come to a conclusion. She saw Dooku's actions as wrong, but she could not blame him for why he had made them. She was lost, she needed comfort, and he too had been wronged by the Jedi. They needed each other more than they knew. Dooku transformed into a servant of the light because of his friend, and Ahsoka grew a wider perception of the galaxy around her. While the Clone Wars were destined to come to an end without Order 66, due to the deaths of Grievous, Dooku, and Palpatine, there would be a sense of incompletion in the galaxy. The war just ended. No fierce final stands, no harsh rhetoric, just the flashing of white flags and the surrender of the dying separatist movement. This feeling was replicated elsewhere, especially for the former master and apprentice. Both would have some sense of completion, but not with one another. Anakin would welcome Luke and Leia into his life, and Ahsoka would send a deployment of reserve forces to Mandalore, where they would send Death Watch, Crimson Dawn, and Maul into extinction. Ahsoka remained on Serena for years to come, where she would continue serving the light, while also comprehending her own view of the galaxy around her. She would eventually have her first interaction with Master Kenobi, 3 years after the Battle of Coruscant. Anakin had since abandoned the Order, and was working with the Peace Corps, hence why he was not here with Obi-Wan. Kenobi was here to clear the air. The Council kept their distance from Sereno. While Ahsoka took up the political mantle, without even having been from the planet, she held Dooku's former role as Countess Tano. She vowed to protect her friend's people, and do right by them, and meshed with what she had learned from the Jedi, and from the good man that was Dooku, to help a floundering society. Tyranus had failed many times, especially for Sereno, but Ahsoka would be there to pick up the pieces for his people and people elsewhere in the galaxy. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka would have a very nice conversation, one that ended in a few tears and a solid hug. They missed each other, and they were able to make amends. It would take more time for Anakin and Ahsoka to make those same amends. Much of the tension that remained was Anakin realizing that he had hurt Ahsoka by what he had done. In the moment, he wanted to be angry, but in hindsight, especially after talking to Padme, he realized that he needed to be open and receptive of what Ahsoka had gone through without the Jedi and without him. About 6 years after the Battle of Coruscant, Master and Apprentice would reunite. It would start rough, but slowly and surely, they would be just like they once were. They had some struggles to get past, but they would. Both were committed to being friends again, and they both wanted each other in their lives. The change that followed this would see Ahsoka and Anakin viewing the war drastically differently, and even their actions as such. They were both so young, and that was perhaps the greatest sin of the war. The Jedi were changing with Yoda stepping down, and the Republic too was kind of changing, but more importantly, after all of their failures as friends to each other, they came back around to their original bond. They found their true selves. Anakin had changed, Ahsoka had found her grounding, and both continued being great friends and supporters of the other for the rest of their lives. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons: Edwin Wells, Ozpin, Jack Silver, General Alexander, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lendl Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rose Bird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Priormark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Ban, Lalian, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Unlink666, Bamman Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fordo's Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Man 3 First Names, Darksane46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. Okay, really different there. I definitely went with a route that I don't think would be expected from the thumbnail. I went into the story wanting to tell a story that makes you feel even more bad for Dooku than you do in the original timeline. For whatever reason, this idea of Dooku starting to come back to the light and giving you this hope that he's actually going to come back and live a full life, to live out the rest of his life as a happy person, as a friend to Ahsoka, as a mentor to Ahsoka, and then that just being stripped away from him so violently and brutally. That effect, and that for Ahsoka, seeing it and being on the receiving end of it, being the confirmation of what Dooku said, despite his exaggeration of lies, is that Anakin is a hero of the Jedi, someone they prop up as a hero, acting like that, acting so erratically and not like a Jedi, and her seeing that up front and seeing that the Jedi path is not for her in this timeline, and really kind of rejecting that and almost becoming more of a politician towards the end, becoming more of what Dooku aspired to be if he hadn't fallen down the path with Sidious. And that's kind of like the weird thing that kind of goes on here is Dooku realizes of how much of his life he kind of missed out on, and actually having someone like Ahsoka, someone not so focused on darkness but focused on trying to find herself, he ends up finding himself. And I think it's kind of beautifully tragic in that way. So I hope you all enjoyed. It's definitely different, maybe not for everyone, but you know, always trying to mix it up for you guys. Anyways, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.